In 1886, when embalmers unwrapped a mummy pulled from a hidden royal cache in Egypt, they found something that stopped them cold. His mouth was frozen wide open, contorted, like he died mid-scream. He had no name written anywhere on his body. He wasn't wrapped in the fine linen every pharaoh and noble received. He was wrapped in rough, unclean sheepskin, a material ancient Egyptians associated with impurity, specifically chosen, it seems, to deny him a peaceful afterlife. For over a century, nobody knew who he was. Then, in 2012, a team of forensic scientists ran CT scans and DNA tests on this nameless mummy and on a pharaoh who died more than 3,000 years earlier, and the results connected them directly to one of the only documented royal assassination attempts in all of ancient Egyptian history. A real conspiracy. A real trial. A real king with his throat cut. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what the science found, what the ancient legal record actually says about the plot to kill this king, and why the man now suspected of being the ringleader may be the very same mummy still frozen in that scream. Subscribe before we go in, because this is a real murder case, 3,000 years cold, and it's finally been reopened. Start with the king at the center of it. Ramesses III ruled Egypt from around 1186 to 1155 BC, during the 20th dynasty, and by most accounts he was a genuinely significant and militarily successful pharaoh. He's credited with defending Egypt against a serious invasion by the so-called Sea Peoples, a coalition of raiders whose campaigns had already destabilized much of the eastern Mediterranean in this period. He should have died an old man, remembered as a defender of the kingdom. Instead, ancient Egyptian records describe something else entirely. A conspiracy inside his own palace, organized by one of his own wives, aimed at putting a different son on the throne in place of the legitimate heir. We know this isn't speculation, because the plot itself survives in a real ancient document known as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, an actual trial record, written by the Egyptians themselves, describing the prosecution of the conspirators after the plot was uncovered. According to the papyrus, a secondary wife of Ramesses III, named T, organized the conspiracy specifically to place her own son, a prince named Pentuer, on the throne instead of Ramesses' designated heir. The document describes an extensive network of conspirators pulled in to make the plan work, including senior officials inside the royal harem, a commander of Nubian troops, and even individuals responsible for producing wax figures and magical spells intended to help incapacitate palace guards during the attempt. This wasn't a small, desperate plot. It was a coordinated effort involving people with real access to the king. The trial record names dozens of people ultimately implicated and punished, some executed outright, others compelled to take their own lives as a specific form of punishment, a practice the papyrus describes with a particular, almost formal phrasing, that certain conspirators were left to end their own lives rather than being executed by another's hand. Prince Pentuer himself, according to the record, was one of those forced into this fate, allowed, or perhaps required, to die by his own hand rather than face execution directly. For centuries, this was the extent of what historians actually knew. A documented plot, a formal trial, named conspirators, and recorded punishments. What nobody could confirm for certain, for a very long time, was whether the assassination attempt against Ramesses III himself had actually succeeded. That uncertainty existed because earlier examinations of Ramesses III's mummy, using older imaging technology, hadn't found conclusive evidence of a fatal wound. Some historians assumed he might have survived the initial attempt, only to die of unrelated causes sometime afterward. That changed in 2012, when a research team led by Zahi Hawass and radiologist Sahar Salim conducted a detailed CT scan of the mummy, using far higher resolution than any previous examination. What they found, published in the British Medical Journal, settled the question definitively: a deep wound cut across Ramesses III's throat, severe enough to have been immediately fatal, extending down to the cervical vertebrae, a wound that earlier, cruder imaging techniques had simply missed. For the first time in modern history, There was direct physical, forensic confirmation that Ramesses III really had been murdered, not merely the target of a plot that failed. That confirmed the conspiracy had succeeded in killing the king. It didn't, on its own, tell researchers what happened to the person the ancient trial record says was behind it, Prince Pentower. Which brings us to the nameless mummy found decades earlier, in one of the strangest burials ever recovered from ancient Egypt. In 1881, a hidden cache of royal mummies was discovered at Deir el-Bahri, a location where, centuries after these kings had originally been buried, ancient priests had secretly relocated numerous royal bodies to protect them from ongoing tomb robbery, moving them into one shared hiding place. Among the recognized pharaohs recovered from that cache was one body that stood apart from all the others, catalogued simply as Unknown Man E. When his wrappings were removed in 1886, his face was found locked in an open-mouthed, contorted expression, which is exactly where the nickname the Screaming Mummy comes from. And it's not an exaggeration. Photographs of the unwrapped mummy show a genuinely striking, visibly distressed expression. Unlike the calm, composed faces typical of properly mummified Egyptian royalty. Everything about how this man was buried departs sharply from standard royal practice, and each departure appears to have been deliberate rather than accidental. He wasn't wrapped in fine linen, he was wrapped in rough sheepskin, a material ancient Egyptian religious tradition treated as ritually unclean, specifically inappropriate for proper burial. His body wasn't eviscerated the way royal mummification normally required. Internal organs typically removed and preserved separately in canopic jars were, in his case, apparently left in place, consistent with a rushed, deliberately substandard mummification rather than the careful, expensive process reserved for royalty. No name was inscribed anywhere on his body or his wrappings, an extraordinarily significant omission in ancient Egyptian belief, since Egyptians held that a person's name was essential to their survival in the afterlife. Denying someone their name and burial was, in effect, an attempt to erase them from existence beyond death. Taken together, this wasn't simply a poor or rushed burial. It reads as a deliberately punitive one, someone with genuine royal status, treated in death with calculated disrespect, specifically designed to deny him the proper afterlife every other member of his family would have received. That combination, a body treated with royal adjacent significance, but buried with deliberate ritual punishment, is exactly what led Hawass and Salim's 2012 team to investigate whether Unknown Man E might actually be Prince Pentower. The conspirator, the Judicial Papyrus of Turin says, was forced to take his own life for his role in the plot against Ramesses III. To test that, researchers went beyond CT imaging and conducted genetic analysis, comparing Y chromosome and select autosomal genetic markers between Unknown Man E and the mummy of Ramesses III himself. The results showed genetic markers consistent with a father-son relationship between the two men supporting, though not providing absolute, unimpeachable proof of, the identification of Unknown Man E as Pentower specifically, since the genetic data confirms a close paternal relationship to Ramesses III without independently confirming which of his sons this particular body actually is. It's also worth being direct about a limitation researchers themselves acknowledge. No inscription anywhere names this body. So the identification rests on the strength of circumstantial evidence, the genetic relationship, the punitive burial style consistent with what the historical record says happened to Pentower, and the timing rather than a definitive written label. It's the strongest case anyone has been able to build, and it remains, honestly, a well-supported hypothesis rather than an absolutely closed case. The CT scan also picked up additional detail that adds weight to the theory without settling it completely. Unlike Ramesses III's own mummy, Unknown Man E shows no clear physical trauma consistent with a violent execution, no visible cut wounds, no obvious blunt trauma. That absence is actually consistent with the ancient legal record's specific description of Pentower's punishment. Not execution by another's hand, but being compelled to take his own life, a fate the Egyptians apparently distinguished carefully, in both practice and written record, from ordinary execution. Some researchers examining the case have proposed that the contorted, open-mouthed expression is consistent with death by poisoning or by suffocation, rather than a bladed weapon, plausible methods for someone forced into taking his own life under these specific historical circumstances. Though it's worth being honest that facial expression alone in mummified remains is a genuinely difficult and disputed area of forensic interpretation. And researchers are appropriately cautious about reading too much certainty into it. Step back and look at what's actually been established here, separating confirmed forensic fact from the strongest available interpretation. It's confirmed, directly, through modern CT imaging, that Ramesses III died from a deep, fatal throat wound, genuine, physical, unambiguous evidence of assassination, ending a debate that had genuinely persisted among Egyptologists for decades. It's documented, in an authentic ancient Egyptian legal record, that a formal conspiracy existed to kill him, organized by one of his wives on behalf of her son, involving a substantial network of palace insiders, and that this conspiracy was investigated, tried, and its participants formally punished, some executed, others compelled to take their own lives. And it's a genetically supported, historically consistent, but not absolutely proven hypothesis that the deliberately dishonored nameless mummy known as Unknown Man E is Prince Pentower himself, the conspiracy's intended beneficiary, denied a name, denied proper burial, and left frozen in an expression that has unsettled everyone who's seen it for well over a century. What makes this genuinely different from most ancient mysteries is that it isn't really a mystery about whether something happened. The murder is confirmed. The conspiracy is documented in the conspirator's own trial record, written by the people who prosecuted it. The open question is narrower, and in some ways more human, whether the specific nameless body still sitting in a museum case today is the specific son who wanted his father's throne badly enough to help arrange his murder, and who then paid for it with an afterlife his own culture considered close to a fate worse than death itself. If a face frozen mid-scream for 3,000 years can still raise questions modern forensics hasn't fully closed, there's another cold case from the ancient world waiting on screen right now.